Okay, next snippet on democracies, comparative politics, and in this one the theme is what kind of democracy works best. Okay, there are different kinds, so and you've read about this in your book. You may already know about them, but there's different ways in which democracies can differ from each other. Yeah, let's put it like that. So one of them is in terms of what we call models. And there are three basic models. There's two main ones and the third that I'll talk about. But the parliamentary, the presidential, and then the semi-presidential systems. This can be some pretty boring stuff unless it's in the hands of an expert. So you're welcome on that. I'll try to keep it as exciting as possible. But what's the difference? And who cares? Well, first let's do the difference. The parliamentary system I mentioned first because it's in a lot of ways it's the oldest and it's the most common. Why is it the most common? Some of you probably have already figured this out, but because Great Britain had colonies across the world and they were a parliamentary system, so that's what they forced upon their colonies. So that's why we see a lot more parliamentary systems than presidential systems. Presidential systems are the dominant system in the Americas. In North and South America and the Caribbean, you'll find a lot of parliamentary systems. But in the Americas and certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you find the presidential systems. So that's one thing that kind of distinguishes between the two. The other is in the way they operate and what effects that has, and you see some important differences there. So in the parliamentary system, now let's do presidential system first for this one because this is the one we're most familiar with. In the presidential system, the president is elected directly by the people. Big asterisk on that in the United States with the existence of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, of course, is very indirect. You're voting for these electors who then, after the election is over, meet in Washington and cast the official votes. And that can be extremely controversial. And everything else equal, it is less democratic than other types of elections because it's so indirect and because it's so far removed from one person, one vote. However, having said that, it's a lot more directly elected, even in the United States, than it is in a parliamentary system where you don't vote. When you go to vote in a parliamentary election, you're not voting for prime minister. You kind of are, but you're not. You're voting for the party. And what does that mean? How does it happen? Because the prime minister or the chancellor or whatever the title is, whatever that specific position is elected directly by the legislature. The legislature chooses the chancellor or prime minister. So people vote for the parties, but the party chooses, elects the prime minister. So that's a little bit different. In theory, it makes a presidential system better in that there's a closer tie, a more direct tie from the leader of the country to the citizens. So that's one point about the differences. Presidential systems. The next thing, just technically in terms of operations, the president is in charge of everything, serves the role of the head of state and the head of government. What does that mean? Well, think about the concept of the commander-in-chief. In the U.S., the president is responsible for pretty much everything, including foreign policy and setting and enacting domestic policy. And that's simply not the case in a parliamentary system, where the leader, again, prime minister, chancellor, whatever it happens to be, is the head of the government, but not the head of state. So, in a democratic monarchy like the United Kingdom, the head of the state is the monarch, the queen. Somewhere else, the head of the state might be the president. So parliamentary systems usually will have a prime minister and then a president. The president has a lot less power, but will serve as the head of the state. So that's a difference. A huge practical difference, and one that I really want you to think about and be aware of, is the representation aspect of parliamentary systems versus presidential systems. And what I mean by this more specifically is that presidential systems tend to be two-party systems. And you will hear a lot of complaints. I'm sure you've all heard these discussions in one form or another, or a criticism of the United States is that we're a two-party system, and that's holding us back. It would be better if we had a functioning, healthy system in which third parties could survive and thrive. And we simply don't have that here. Well, guess what? They don't have it anywhere in presidential systems. It just doesn't exist. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This is an advantage of a parliamentary system. It's not a universally good difference, though. It's not always automatically an advantage. It can be bad as well in a parliamentary system. Having more parties doesn't necessarily help you. So what happens in a parliamentary system is, in an election, you need to form a majority government. So either a party will win 50% plus one of the votes or more, and they will be in control of the government, in which case, because the parliament chooses the prime minister, they are directly tied to and cooperative with each other. You're never going to have gridlock if you win 51% of the vote. But that doesn't often happen, in part because you have so many parties. So if you don't get 51% of the vote, say you get 39% and the next highest party gets 22%, then what you have to do is form a majority government. And that can be a lot tougher than it sounds. And it's something which European parliamentary democracies have been struggling with for the last 20 years. We've got problems here in the United States. This is something they've been struggling with. Countries are finding it, or parties are finding it increasingly difficult to get a large enough share of the vote that they can either win a majority of the votes or form a coalition that makes sense. That's not going to fall apart. That's going to consist of two parties instead of 4 or 5, where the different parties who work together have their views on public policy is close enough that they can work together. That's harder and harder to do. So that's one thing to keep in mind about parliamentary systems. When they do form a majority government, they get a lot done. And they will continue to get something done until there is an election. And that election may be scheduled or it may be unscheduled. Parliamentary elections have this fun thing called a snap election, in which the leader of the country, the prime minister, can call an election anytime they want. So let's say they have an election scheduled for 3 years from now, but they decide they're doing really, really well and they're worried they might not 2 years from now. They'll do a snap election on the hopes that, or the assumption that they're going to win, and then the clock is reset back to 0. So instead of having to win an election 3 years from now, they now have to win it 4 years from now, what have you. In presidential systems, you don't have this. You have regularly scheduled elections. You know exactly when they are, when they're going to be, etc. So those are some of the more important differences between the two. A couple other that I will mention is that presidential systems are more easily gridlocked because there is that conflict because the president is not necessarily in alignment with the legislature. So that's one reason why we have so much gridlock, and it's not uncommon for that to occur globally in presidential systems. The last thing I want to mention is maybe the most important one, is that our system has been around for a long time, but just in general, parliamentary systems tend to be a little bit more stable. So keep in mind here that when you're criticizing certain aspects of the U.S. electoral system, be aware that what you may be criticizing are aspects of more generally the presidential system. And how do we switch that? We don't. We're pretty much stuck with this. And so we need to make do with what we have inside of the presidential systems by understanding it's very unlikely that things are ever going to systematically improve democratically in the United States via third parties. Get the third party stuff out of your mind, because you're just not going to get that in a presidential system. Okay. I will go ahead and cover it on this snippet, and then on our next one we're going to be talking about civil rights and civil liberties and how they sometimes come into conflict, even though that doesn't seem like they should. That maybe seem a little weird, but there's a natural contradiction or conflict between civil rights and civil liberties. So that will be the next snippet. But for now, let me end with referenda and initiatives. Remember, in the last snippet we did the definition. Democracy is direct or indirect. And most of democracy globally is of the indirect type. Well, referenda and initiatives are the direct types. That's the primary form of the direct types. And these are when individuals vote on a specific issue. We live in a federal system. Remember this from way back early in the semester. So our elections are a great big jumbled up mess because you have 50 different states with 50 different rules. A lot of electoral powers are granted to the states and not the federal government. And one of them is this issue of direct democracy. So some states will have referenda, some will have initiatives, some will have both. A lot of times there's different rules in how you do that. Here in Virginia, we have referendum, but we don't have initiatives. What's the damn difference? Initiatives are when citizens themselves propose a question to be asked on the ballot, right? These are citizen initiatives. They're begun and done by citizens, where you want weed to be legal in Virginia, so you form a group, you gather together all the signatures, you do all the legal paperwork, you submit those signatures, and if everything works well, then in November of whatever year, on the ballot there will be a question. A lot of you already voted here in Virginia, and you know that there were two different forms of this. Now, in Virginia, those weren't initiatives, those were referendum. And Virginia, as I said, doesn't have initiatives. Referendum means it comes from the legislature. So your state legislature, your legislature, whatever it happens to be, votes to offer up this question on a ballot in an election. And those are quite common, too, here in Virginia. So we had two on this one. One of them involves the anti-gerrymandering question of whether or not we're going to have a commission that decides that does all the redistricting every 10 years after a census. But globally, they're quite common. The U.S. does not do them at all at the federal level, and then it's state by state. Some U.S. states do them a lot, some others. So around the world, what you'll find is some countries do very little of this, and some countries do a lot. If you have a unitary government as opposed to federal, then it all comes from that national central government. One question being asked, the same question to all the citizens. And famously, and these are can be super important. A lot of the, as an example, the question of whether or not to secede has occurred several times over the last 20, 30 years. And these have all been either a referendum or initiatives. Brexit. This was a referendum. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, made a horrific bonehead move. He was pro-Europe, but in the Conservative Party that was skeptical of Europe, and a lot of people in the Conservatives, the Tory Party, had always been skeptical of Europe and always, considered the possibility of leaving Europe. He wanted to get that behind him. He wanted, because he thought he'd win, he wanted to vote on it, have the UK citizens turn it down, and then he and his party could move past that onto other things. They wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Oops. An enormous mistake, because as we all know, he lost that in a very, very tight race, and now the UK is no longer a member of Europe. Also, Quebec has held, the last one was a few decades ago, but there's a movement to secede from Canada. They've held a vote, a popular vote on this. Scotland may do so again in the future, but in the past, several years back, 4 or 5 years back now, they voted to stay, narrowly voted to stay in the UK. Maybe now they'll vote to leave the UK in order to hopefully get back into the EU. These are all direct votes. Interesting one a few years back when Colombia was trying to end the longest running civil war in the world. The government proposed a referendum for a peace treaty. Yes or no? Do you want this armistice between the government and the FARC? This was the revolutionary, left-wing movement. Also some pretty vicious drug-running terrorists as well. Chapter 7. We'll get back to the FARC. And the citizens voted no. They voted to keep the war going. Why not? Because it was too lenient on former members of the FARC, especially officers and leaders. So they reworded it to apply some more punishments against the people who had participated in the FARC, and then it was asked again of the people, and then they accepted it, and the war was ended by direct democracy. So we will. Two more. Last two, we mentioned secession movements before. A couple years back in Spain, Catalonians had a secession vote, and also in Iraq, the Kurds in the northern area held a secession vote, and they both voted yes to secede from their respective countries, but they're still very much part of their respective countries. Why? Because the government said, to hell with you, and you're not going anywhere. And in Spain, they sent troops and military police into Barcelona, and they have prosecuted the leaders of that movement. All right, we'll leave it there, and we'll be back with the next day. Within the next 24 hours, I'll have another snippet up about democracy, specifically civil liberties and civil rights.